بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم فقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah. In our look at الدروس الرمضانية للأمة المحمدية, the Ramadan lessons for the Ummah of Muhammad by Habib Muhammad bin Ali, Habib Muhammad bin Abdullah bin Ali al-Aydurus alayhi radwanullahi ta'ala. We have reached a section where he talks about the sunan, the sunnah actions of the fast. But before we go into that, we want to first leave any questions or leave any moments for any residual questions from yesterday, and to just point out one thing that I have to clarify from yesterday. In the Hanafi school, if a person is eating and then the adhan comes in and they have food already in their mouth, it's excused if it's little. If it's a lot of food, then it's not excused. If it's a lot of food, then it's easier to take out. One should spit it out. So it's not that like the buzzard beater last bite of the hamburger, right? 1 minute before the time comes in. No, but if there's a small amount of food, and they define the small amount of food as something that's around the size of a chickpea, something that could be lodged in the teeth. So if it's that much food that's left, and one swallows it after the adhan, it's excused. If it's bigger, if it's more than that, then it would not be excused. They would have to spit it out. And the same thing applies to the salah. If someone started the salah and they had some food in their mouth and it came loose and they swallowed it, if it was small, it's excused. If it's big, then it breaks the prayer. Any questions from yesterday? If there's any Hanafi questions, then we can answer it. But if there are any detailed, specific Shafi questions that are not mentioned clearly in the book, then we might have to collect them, gather them, maybe have one of the students write it out and take it to Sheikh Yahya, inshallah. But we can listen to them. If there's any at a hand. And oh yeah, so the ghusl, the ritual bath, can be done before Fajr or even during the fast, right? So in the Hanafi school, the only issue would be the washing of the mouth, because washing of the mouth is obligatory in the ghusl. So you would still wash your mouth, but just not as far back as you would normally do it, and it would not affect the fast at all to take a shower. Even if you were just hot, you wanted to take a shower to cool down, it wouldn't affect the fast. And it's not makruh to do it. Any other questions? 7. So today he talks about the sunan of fasting, and then the order of the book, I'm not exactly sure of the wisdom, but after going through the sunnahs of the fast, he goes into specific events in the prophetic biography that happened during Ramadan. Right? So right after speaking of the sunnah, which we'll talk about today, he goes into the battle of Badr, which happened in Ramadan. All right, and the death of Abu Jahl also happened in Ramadan. There's a few events that he mentions here. And then he goes back into a few different issues that are still related to fiqh. So we're going to skip the stories of Badr and all that for tomorrow, inshallah. So just because everything, to keep all the fiqh stuff together in one would be easier to keep track of things instead of bouncing back and forth. And then tomorrow we'll talk about Badr. We'll talk about the specific mushrikeen that were killed in Badr. That were some of the worst enemies to Islam. And then the conquest of Mecca also happened in Ramadan. And then we'll move on from there, inshallah. So today we're going to cover the sunnahs of the fast, and then some leftover fiqh issues, some of which was asked yesterday, so today will be more of a clarification on that. So now, the idea of the sunnah, right, is an extremely important part of our deen. Right? So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls us to in the Quran, right, is not only to fulfill what is considered obligatory, but to also do it in a specific way. Right? And that specific way is what we understand is the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how he did what he did, how he fulfilled the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because anything that Allah commanded for the ummah, right, essentially the prophets, with few exceptions, also were obliged to follow those commandments. Right? So the prophets all had to fast. The prophets all had to pray. The prophets all gave zakat. Actually, the prophets did not need to, it was not obligatory for them to give zakat because their wealth doesn't have any filth in it to be purified. And so that's one distinction. But other things, other obligations like the Hajj and all these all apply to the prophets as well. Right? But when the prophets do it, they set a standard and they set an example of how that action is done, both the outward standards of the action, which includes the obligations for it to be valid, but even above that, for the action to be beautiful with Allah, and then the inward actions as well, the sincerity in it, the humility in it, the state of heart that the servant should have before their Lord in doing that action. So when we look about the sunnahs of fasting, because fasting is mostly leaving, it's abstention, you're not really doing anything. It's actually the opposite of doing. You're not doing. So the sunnahs are not as obvious. So their outward sunnahs are not as obvious. There's outward sunnahs before Fajr, there's outward sunnahs after Maghrib, but during the fast, there's no real outward sunnahs. However, there are inward sunnahs of the Prophet ﷺ throughout the day of the fasting. So he talks about first, the first sunnah that he talks about is actually before the fast starts. It's not during the fast. It is suhoor, the meal of suhoor. And suhoor is any meal that is taken in waqtu sahar. Waqtu sahar. Sahar is the moments, the pre-dawn moments. So it's the time between half of the night until the rising of until the Fajr. So if you were to take the time, maybe someone can pull out a calculator. So Maghrib comes in 7:30 something, right? And then Fajr comes in at 5:30? I don't even know anymore. 5 o'clock, right? So if you divide that time in half, right? So that would be the start of suhoor time. So from the second half of the night until Fajr, any meal in that time is considered suhoor. Right? And there are many ahadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he encouraged and even commanded, right, to do the suhoor meal, to take the suhoor meal. So some people it's easy for them to fast. Right? And whether they have suhoor or not, it doesn't really make a difference to them. Right? However, right, in such a case, it's still important to apply the sunnah because it's a sunnah, because the Prophet ﷺ did it. And he mentions some of the reasons in it, right? Besides the obvious, that it makes it easier to fast. So additional to the obvious benefits of the suhoor, he mentions, in this hadith is narrated by Imam Muslim, he says, فَصْلُ مَا بَيْنَ صِيَامِنَا وَصِيَامِ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ أَكْلَةُ السُّحُورِ. The difference between our fast and the fast of the people of the book is eating the pre-dawn meal. And their fast has some different rulings as well. I remember my mother used to do a 40-day fast. It was quite intense, but you can drink water, so it's not as hard. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he said in another hadith narrated by Imam Ahmad and Ibn Hibban, إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَمَلَائِكَتَهُ يُصَلُّونَ عَلَى الْمُتَسَحِّرِينَ. Indeed, Allah and His angels send prayers upon those who perform the suhoor meal, who eat the suhoor meal. So this is the similar phrase as the verse in the Quran that we read about the Prophet ﷺ. إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَمَلَائِكَتَهُ يُصَلُّونَ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا صَلُّوا عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ وَتَسْلِيمًا. Indeed, Allah and His angels send blessings on those who eat the suhoor meal. And then he narrates from Anas bin Malik narrates, and this is in Bukhari and Muslim, تَسَحَّرُوا, it's a command. Eat the pre-dawn meal, فَإِنَّ فِي السُّحُورِ بَرَكَةً, because in the pre-dawn meal there is a blessing. There is a blessing. Abu Hurairah narrates, I'm just going to read these. He says that I entered upon the Prophet ﷺ while he was eating the pre-dawn meal. And the Prophet said, إِنَّهَا بَرَكَةٌ, it is a blessing. أَعْطَاكُمُ اللَّهُ إِيَّاهَا, which Allah gave you. فَلَا تَدَعُوهَا, so do not leave it out. So do not leave it out. And there are many hadith. We'll mention just one more. Al-Irbad ibn Sariyah radiyallahu anhu says that the Prophet ﷺ called me to, invited me to his pre-dawn meal in Ramadan. He invited me to have suhoor with him. And he said, Halumma ila al-ghidha al-mubarak. Come towards the blessed nourishment. Come towards the blessed nourishment. So he called suhoor blessed nourishment. Right? And my experience of Arab countries is that they generally invite people more often for suhoor. Right? I've had more suhoors with my teachers than iftars for some reason, and maybe it has something to do with this sunnah. The Prophet called Irbad bin Sariyah and invited him to have suhoor with him. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's also reported to have said, "Ista'inu bi ta'ami as-sahar ala siyam an-nahar wal bin qaylulati ala qiyam al-layl." Seek assistance in fasting the days by having the food of the pre-dawn meal, and seek assistance in standing in the night in worship by having a midday nap, the qaylula, the midday nap. So the author here, he kind of tangents in a very beautiful tangent. He says, what does it mean that suhoor is barakah? And we know the word barakah means ziyadah. Right? It has in it the meaning of ziyadah, but also has the meaning of ithbatu khayrin ilahiyyin fi shayt. That a divine goodness is established in something, that's placed in something. Right? And for those who are allergic to words like this, right? It's clear cut in the Quran, which we read 2 days ago, that Allah mentions about the tabuts, they mention the ark of the covenant, right, that is carried by Musa and Harun, that had the remnants of Musa and Harun's families in it. Allah says, "Fiha sakinah." In it is divine tranquility. The angels are carrying it. Allahu Akbar. Right, so there's a barakah in this meal, right? So, and he mentions a few of the reasons. He says, one, that and yubaraka fin qalil hatta tahsul al-i'ana ala as-sawm, that even if you eat a little bit, it's very helpful in the fast. Right? And this coming from someone who completely missed the suhoor the other day, right? Except for like a few minutes of some strawberries in the last seconds, right? And that was the hardest day. But it wasn't that the other days that I would have eaten much more, but even eating a little bit, right, is very helpful, especially if drinking water. Right, so there's blessing in that even though the amount that you're going to eat is not as much as you would, it's sufficient. It has a barakah in such that it's sufficient to help you throughout the day. Whereas on a day when you're not fasting, if you would eat a light breakfast, you would be hungry really quickly. Right, there's an extra barakah in Ramadan. The second, he says that it's nafyul muhasaba ala hadha ta'am. The meaning of there's barakah in suhoor is that Allah will not ask you about what you ate in suhoor. Allah will not ask you about whether you ate too much. Allah will not ask you whether you this or that about the food, right? As He would in other types of meals. And then the last, he mentions that the reward and the blessings that are acquired by fulfilling the sunnah in the hereafter. So every single sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ has its own light, and it has its own reward in this world, spiritually, in the dunya as well, and as well as the hereafter. But the third meaning is the blessing that we get in the hereafter for following us. Now, the second sunnah that he talks about is ta'jeel al-futur wa ta'khir al-suhoor. So he doesn't mention that iftar is a sunnah, because iftar technically is not a sunnah. It's in some ways, right, and technically it could be an obligation to break the fast, because the Prophet ﷺ, he prohibited sawm al-wisal, the continuous fast. And a continuous fast is not that you fast Monday and then you fast Tuesday and then you fast Wednesday. The continuous fast is that you fast Monday and you never broke it. And now it's Tuesday, you still haven't broken it. And now it's Wednesday, you still haven't broken it. So since doing that, having a continuous fast where there is no iftar at all is prohibited, then breaking the fast would then be more than just a sunnah. It would be an obligation of sorts. But he says to hasten the iftar, to hurry up and do the iftar, and to delay the suhoor, to delay the pre-dawn meal, and to hasten the post or the after the sunset meal. And he mentions here the hadith narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, لا يزال الناس بخير ما عجل الفطرة, that people will remain in a good state as long as they hurried their fitrah, their breaking of the fast up. As long as they hurried the breaking of the fast. Right? And in another narration of this by Imam Ahmad, he adds another sentence, وَأَخَّرُ السُّحُورِ, that the people will remain in a state of goodness as long as they hurry their iftar and they delay their suhoor. There's an additional part at the end. And he mentions that the meaning of that people will remain in a good state, he says that they will remain in goodness in their religion as long as they follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is in contrast to the ways that the people of the book would fast. And they would not hasten their iftar and they would not delay their suhoor if they even had the suhoor. Right? As we mentioned just now, the difference between us and the fast of the people of the book is that we eat suhoor. And he mentions here a very important discussion about what does it mean to hasten your iftar. So he says that hastening the iftar is conditioned that you are certain that Maghrib is in. That you are certain that the sun has set, right? And the sun has to set such that the sphere of the sun has to be completely hidden under the horizon. If any portion of the sun itself is still above the horizon, it is not Maghrib. And he says that and the way you would know that is if you were to be standing at the shore of the ocean, or on a completely flat land, or on the top of a mountain, you can't see the sun from that point, then that's the real Maghrib. Right? But if you're blocked by something, so from here we have I don't know if that's west, but say the sun was on the other side of this mountain here, we wouldn't have that certainty as if we were standing on the shore of California, right? West Coast, it sets in the west, right? So then you would have to estimate it according to the timing, the clock. So what it means to hurry the iftar is that soon as the sunset is definitely, and the sunset has definitely occurred, then to immediately eat the fast, to immediately eat the iftar food, even if it's a date or two, right? So, and not to unnecessarily delay it, right? If there is any doubt, that delay is not unnecessary. That delay is part of the sunnah, right? It is not considered it is not considered sunnah to hasten the iftar to a time where you're doubtful whether Maghrib is in or not, because then that would be sinful and may even break the fast if a person miscalculated. So he mentions here a hadith in this regard, and he says that Baina ana na'im atani rajulan. The narrator says, I heard the Messenger of Allah say that while I was sleeping, two people came to me. These are two angels. And they took me by my sides, and they took me toward a very tall mountain. And they said, climb. And I said, I'm not able to. And they said, don't worry, we'll help you through it. Right? We'll get you up there. So I climbed until I got to the very top of the mountain, and I heard very severe wailing, right, screaming. And I said to them, what are these voices? They said, this is the wailing of the people of the hellfire. And then they took me to a group of people who were hanging by their hamstrings. And their ashdaq is the side of their cheeks. Their cheeks were ripped open, and there was blood flowing from them. And I said to them, who are these people? And I was told, they are those who performed the iftar before it was permissible to eat. They ate the iftar too early. Right, so when we're saying to hasten the iftar, doesn't mean before Maghrib. Right? Once Maghrib is certain that it is in, then right away one should eat. And And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, delaying the suhoor, delaying the pre-dawn meal, right, to the time where there is no doubt. Right? Up before, there is possibility that Fajr could have come in, and the Shafi'i scholars actually determined what that means. What is that time where there could be doubts? And they mentioned that it's the same amount of time that it would take to read 20 verses of the Quran in a moderate, methodical recitation, which would, if you did that, it would equate to about 20 minutes. So the imsak time that's on a lot of calendars is somewhere around 20 minutes. It could be a little bit less, right? So that's the time where there is a possibility of doubts. So the delaying of the Fajr would be to eat just before that, right? To eat just before, not to eat an hour and a half before that. Right? So if you eat an hour and a half before that, it's still considered suhoor because it's from the half of the night, right? But we're missing out on another sunnah, which is to delay. It's closer towards the time of imsak. And he mentions some lines of poetry here from a fiqh book. وَسُنَّ مَا عِلْمٍ غُرُوبِ يُفْطِرُ بِسُرْعَةٍ وَعَكْسُهُ التَّسَحُرُ. And with knowledge of the sunset, it is sunnah to break your fast with bisur'ah, as quick as possible. Right? And the opposite, it applies to the suhoor. Right? Meaning with knowledge that the sun has not risen yet, meaning for Fajr, right? Then it is sunnah to eat quickly. And he mentions also that it's sunnah to apply perfume at the time of suhoor. To apply perfume at the time of suhoor. And that is one of the sunnah mahjura, the abandoned sunnahs. There's a very beautiful book by a great Yemeni scholar. His name is Habib Muhammad bin Alawi al-Aidurus, from the same family as this author. He's more commonly known as Habib Sa'ad. He has one of the famous books that people know him by is his Book of Intentions. The Book of Intentions is a must-have. But he also has another book called The Abandoned Sunnahs, The Abandoned Sunnah Actions. And it's an amazing, amazing work where he compiles a lot of sunnahs where people are remiss in following. So the first sunnah was the suhoor, the pre-dawn meal. The second one was to hasten the iftar and to delay the pre-dawn meal. And the third is that when you do make your iftar, what do you eat? Right? What type of food are we going to eat? He says that the sunnah is to use dates. The sunnah is dates, and this is not just a coincidence because the Prophet was in a culture where dates were the most readily. It's not that. Right? There is a special quality to dates that the Prophet preferred dates over other types of fruits. Right? So, and Anas bin Malik narrates, and this hadith is in Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi. He says that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ used to break his fast before praying Maghrib ala ratabat, with rutab. Rutab are a specific type of dates, and the rutab literally means moist, so they're a juicy type of date. Right? فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ رُطَبَاتٌ فَتَمَرَاتٌ. If there's no rutab, if there's no, that one type of date was not available, then tamarat. Tamarat is any type of date, right? Where you get the word tamar. Right? And if there was no tamar, he would break his fast with water first. He would eat water first. Right? What's called فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ حَسَوَاتٍ مِّن مَاءٍ. He would take a swallow of water. And there are a lot of, and dates are obviously one of the superfoods, for sure. And it's really ajib because dates are like 80 to 90% sugar, right? But it's a natural sugar. And even to the extent that if a person who is diabetic were to eat them, it wouldn't affect them as much as pure sugar would be or refined sugar would. So there's a lot of benefit, and he mentions here that maybe one of the wisdoms why the Messenger ﷺ was specific and keen on using dates specifically to break his fast was because he says here of fawaid jammah, the immense amounts of benefits in the nourishment for the body, and he mentions a few of them. He says yuhalli riq, it sweetens the saliva, right? And by doing that, it prevents worms. Right? Dude is worms, literally. Yaqtulu dude. It kills the dudes. Right? Not us dudes, but it kills the worms. Right? The plural of dude is didan. وَيُعِيدُ لِلْجَسَدِ مَا فَقَدَهُ مِنَ الْغِذَاءِ, and it replenishes the nourishment that the body is missing because of the fasting. Right? And additionally, it is a fruit that is nourishing, it is a medicine, and it's sweet and delicious. So he adds those last ones. Right, so the third sunnah here is to break the fast specifically with dates. Right? If we don't have dates, then it is better to eat something that is natural than something cooked. Right? If we want to prioritize what should we eat first, if we don't have dates, then maybe some other type of fruit would be beneficial. Or like figs. Figs are quite similar to dates, or even strawberries, or some type of fruit that's natural. Right? And then we can go into our samosas and our other stuff. Right? So it's not an all or nothing. Right? But to start with the dates is important. The fourth is Salatul Tarawih. Allahu Akbar. So the prayer of the Salatul Tarawih, he says here, its definition is it's an additional prayer. Right? Let's get the words correct. It's an nafil, it's an additional prayer that the Muslims perform in the month of Ramadan after the Salat al-Isha. But before the Witr. So in between Isha and the Witr. Now for the Hanafis, just as a benefit, if a person prayed Isha, okay, so say Zayd, our friend Zayd, there's no Zayds in here, right? Okay, I don't want to use an example and the person's actually here. So say our friend Zayd, he prays Isha at 9:15 at Al-Maqasid, and then after that he realizes, but before the Tarawih he realizes, he prays the Isha in the congregation, and then he prays Tarawih in Maqasid. Then he realizes that for Isha he didn't have wudu, right? But he did make a new wudu before Tarawih, right? So the Tarawih counts. Right? But he will repeat the Isha and he doesn't repeat the Tarawih. So in the Hanafi school, the time for Tarawih is the time of Isha. It is the same time as Isha, but it is a condition that if you can, without excuse, the Tarawih has to come after Isha. But if there is an excuse like this, then you don't have to repeat the Isha. Right? So the time for Tarawih is between Isha and Witr. Between Isha and Witr. Right? And it is, in Hanafi school, it's considered an emphasized sunnah for the men and for the women. It's an emphasized sunnah for men and for women to pray in general. And it's another emphasized sunnah, a communal emphasized sunnah, that some people in the community have to do it in congregation. And to do it in congregation. So if a person prayed the 20 rakats by themselves, they would have achieved one of the two sunnahs. And if some people in the community prayed in congregation, then the responsibility would fall off all of them. Here he mentions that it's sunnah mustahabba, that it's a recommended sunnah in the Shafi'i school. Now the amounts of raka'ats, Allahu Akbar. Two things that are very unfortunate in Ramadan, that were originally a source of complete unity, right, have become a means of discrepancy and the means of the egos creeping out, because the egos are not chained up. Shaitan's chained up, but the egos are free. Right? So one of them is, right, instead of Star Wars, we have moon wars. Right? Did you see the moon? Did I see the moon? Who saw the moon? Calculations, right? All these things. And the second one is Tarawih. How many rakats? How many rakats of Tarawih? Right? So he mentions here very clearly the opinion of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that the amount of rakats for Tarawih is 20. Right? After each 2 rakats, there is a salam. So, and the reason why it's called Tarawih, from the word Rawha, which means to rest, is that after every 4 rakats, right, so 2 salam, then there's a Rawha, there's a break. So at the time of the Sahaba, they would pray after every 4, they would sit and do their own individual acts of worship for the same amount of time that it took to pray that 4 rakats. And that's why it was called Tarawih. Generally today, we don't do that because it's already difficult enough for people to attend the 20 rakats, and if we added an extra 15 minutes between every 4 rakats, right, people would find it difficult and not come. So there's other secondary circumstances. Now, right, Right? In light of this, we want to tell the story of how Tarawih came about, and then we can understand in more detail how the 20 rakats how it became part of the deen. So he mentions here in full the hadith of Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. She says that the Prophet ﷺ came out one night, in the middle of the night, and he came to the masjid and he led a prayer. And the people in the masjid, they prayed with him, and they prayed with him until morning, meaning until just before the pre-dawn meal. And the people started to talk. And then the next day, more people came, and they all prayed with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, until, again, just before the morning prayer. And then people started talking even more. The chitter-chatter of the city, people hustle and bustle. Hey, did you guys know that the Prophet prayed a jama'ah, a congregation last night, a special type of prayer? Right? So the next day, kathura ahl al-masjid. The masjid was packed. This is the third night. So the Prophet ﷺ came and he prayed the prayer again, a third time. But the fourth night, Sayyidah Aisha, she says, "Ajaz al-masjid an ahliha." The masjid was overflowing. Right? The masjid was not big enough for the amount of people that were there. Right? And the Prophet did not come out. The Prophet, lam yakhruj ilayhim. He never came out. Right? So the people, now they're really talking. Like, what's going on? We thought there was the prayer and we wanted to join the prayer. So the Prophet, he came out for Fajr. He came out after the Fajr adhan. And after praying the Fajr, he turned to the people as was his habit. So after Fajr, the Prophet would turn and face the people. And on many days, he would ask them about their dreams. And he would interpret it for them. Or if there was something that he needed to say, he would say it. So a lot of the hadith where the Prophet was speaking to them after the prayer was after Fajr. So he turned to them and he said to them, he opened with Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan rasulullah amma ba'du فإنه لم يخف علي شأنكم. I wasn't deeming you coming to the masjid as something insignificant. Like it wasn't that I didn't care about you, essentially. ولكني خشيت أن تفرض عليكم. But I was afraid that it will become obligatory on you. Because if the Prophet ﷺ does something continuously without leaving it at all, right, it goes from being just a sunnah to being an obligation. So he says, I was afraid that it may become fard, obligatory on you, فَتَعْجِزُ عَنْهَا, and you wouldn't be able to do it. You wouldn't be able to consistently keep it up. And this is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. So the Prophet did pray the Tarawih for 3 days, but the fourth day he didn't. Right? So that establishes that it's a sunnah. Now, but that establishes that Tarawih prayer is a sunnah. It still doesn't tell us how many rakats the Prophet prayed. So at the time, the narration continues, and this part of the narration is in Sahih Bukhari. So Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab, during his caliphate, he gathered the companions behind one imam. Right? And the hadith is narrated by Abdurrahman bin Abdul Qadi radiallahu anhu. He says that I came out with Umar to the masjid in the nights of Ramadan. And we saw the people were awza'. They were in small groups, mutafarriqun, right, divided up. That one person was praying over there alone, li nafsihi, by himself. And this person was praying over there with a small little group behind him. And Umar said, Inni ara, it's my opinion, law jama'atu ha'ulai ala wahidin, that we gather all of these people behind one person. Right? Lakana amthal, it would have been more appropriate. In a masjid setting, it's better that people are congregating. Right? So he says, thumma azama, that he resolved on that, I'm going to do it. Right? It's not just an opinion now, it's a decision. So he gathered all of the people behind Ubay bin Ka'b. And Ubay bin Ka'b is one of the best of the reciters of the Sahaba. Right? Then the narrator says, I came out with Umar on another night, and we saw that the people were praying all behind the prayer of one person reciting, Ubay bin Ka'b. And Umar, he said, looking at this beautiful sight of all the people in lines behind one imam, he said, نِعْمَ الْبِدْعَةُ هَذِهِ. What a beautiful innovation that this is. And bid'ah, right? The linguistic meaning of bid'ah is anything that is new that doesn't have a previous example. It doesn't have a previous precedence. Right? So in the linguistic sense, sure, this was definitely a type of bid'ah. However, the legal definition of bid'ah, right, is divided into two types. There's the bid'ah of misguidance, which is that which is new and doesn't have a precedence in the Quran and the Sunnah, and it goes against the Quran and Sunnah. Right? As for that which is new and doesn't have a precedence necessarily in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? But it doesn't go against the Quran and the Sunnah, then it's considered Sunnah Hasanah or Sunnah Mustanbata. It's a subset of the Sunnah. It's a subset of the Sunnah, and Imam Shafi'i called it Bid'ah Hasanah, a good bid'ah, a good innovation. Other scholars prefer to say Sunnah Mustanbata, a derived Sunnah, because it's not a direct Sunnah, it's derived from the Sunnah. It's an example of what the Sunnah could have been, right, if the Prophet were alive at that time. Right, so Umar did that, and he's the caliph, and there is Ali ibn Abi Talib is there, Uthman ibn Affan is there, right? Abdurrahman bin Auf is there, Abdullah bin Mas'ud is there, like the elites of the Sahaba, Khalid bin Walid. These are people that if they thought that he was wrong, they would not have held their tongues. They would have told him to his face, no, this is bid'ah. Right? If they disagreed, they would have said it. Right? And the fact that not a single one of them ever even made a single comment as to what Umar did, but they were in the saf, they were praying, right? They agreed. And this is a type of consensus from the Sahaba. A consensus of the Sahaba is a proof in the Sharia. Right? So the part of the narration, he says, actually, that's where the narration continues. The last sentence is kind of confusing and needs a big commentary. So he says that they were praying, in that narration, they prayed 20 rakats behind Ubay bin Ka'b. Right? And from that day, all of the people of scholarship prayed 20 rakats, except for one group, which is Imam Malik. The Malikis, they prayed 36 rakats. 36 rakats. And we'll see that 20 here is not the maximum, it's the minimum. 20 is a minimum. So, Imam Bayhaqi narrates from As-Sa'ib ibn Yazid, the companion. He says that the people used to stand up in the Tarawih prayer in the month of Ramadan at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, 20 rakats. And then they used to stand up 200 rakats. And they would lean on their staffs during the caliphate of Uthman due to the severe long times of standing. Okay, so it started at 20, it went to 200 during Uthman's caliphate. They didn't take it away, they added to it. Right? So, and Imam Nawawi mentions that this hadith from Sa'ib ibn Yazid, right, is a clear proof that the amount of raka'ats for the standing of the night of Ramadan is the 20 rak'ats, and that this hadith is sahih. It's an authentic hadith. Right, so the Hanafis, and he mentions here also that according to Imam al-Thawri, Sufyan al-Thawri, Imam Abdullah bin Mubarak, Imam al-Shafi'i, all the Hanafis, he calls them Ashab al-Ra'i, the people of the opinions. Right, all the Shafi'is, they said that, and Imam Shafi'i, they all agreed that it was 20 rakats. Imam Shafi'i himself, he said, I saw the people of my town, Mecca, praying 20 rakats. And he says that the author continues, he says the four madhabs, the al-madhahib al-arba'atu, ittafaqat. They are unanimous that the number of Tarawih is 20 rakats with 10 salams, right, and then witr afterwards. But this is not a matter to argue about. This is not a matter to argue about. And he quotes for that reason Imam Subki. Imam Subki said that this is a matter where if there's this difference of opinion, it's not that big a deal because it's a recommended prayer. It's a sunnah prayer. It's not an obligatory prayer or a necessary prayer. So because of that, it is less, the consequences of not praying the full amount are less. So he says, Man sha'a aqalla wa man sha'a akthar. Whoever wants to do, let them do less, and whoever wants, let them do more. And so it's not a point that we argue about. If we go to a masjid and they're only praying 8, right, that's what they want to do, that's what they want to do. Right? Likewise, if someone thinks that they should be praying 8 and they go to a masjid that's praying 20, then let them be. If you want to leave after 8, marhaba. And no one should judge either other person. But we should all be holding ourselves to a higher standard and slowly trying to increase in our deen, so that after being Muslim for 10 years, we should be better than we were when we were Muslim for 1 year. Right? And then when we were Muslim for 20 years, then we should be better than when we were for 10 years. And if a person can do 8 in the masjid, and then because they have work, they go home and do the other 12 because it's easier for them and they can sleep earlier, then everyone has everyone's trying their best. And that's the idea of Ramadan. The 5th sunnah he mentions is al-ikthar min tilawati al-Qur'an. He mentions a list of things to abundantly to recite the Qur'an, remember Allah, do righteous deeds, generosity, meaning charity, extra prayers, and i'tikaf. I'tikaf is the spiritual seclusion in the masjid, and he says especially in the last 10 days, and any type of good deeds. And we mentioned the hadith that anyone who does a voluntary deed, they get the reward as if they did an obligatory action in the month of Ramadan, and anyone who does an obligatory action gets the reward of 70 obligatory actions at the least. Right, so to do any good deed in this time. And the i'tikaf, there's some fiqh rulings with regards to that. In the Hanafi school, the i'tikaf in the last 10 days is an emphasized sunnah, right? But i'tikaf in general is a recommendation, because the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't only do it in the last 10 days. In the last year of his life, he did at least 20 days, if not the whole month, he did the i'tikaf. Any questions up to there before we go into a little bit more fiqhi discussion? Congregation, yeah. And the minimum congregation is 2 people. Unless it's Jum'ah, the minimum congregation would be imam plus 3 people. But even if it's just a husband and a wife, or the mother and the son, right, who is at least murahiq, which is just before baligh, the son can lead the salah if it's a nafil prayer. So the recitation of the Quran will be allowed because it's a jama'ah prayer, but the qunut dua will be silent. To when there's any possible doubts. So whenever there is a possibility that the sun could have already started to rise, that's when you stop immediately. Right, so to stop before that doubt starts. Right. Yeah, so the 15 minutes is usually so the time, there's the time for the actual Fajr. And then the 15 minutes before that is to calculate for any possible mistakes in that calculation of Fajr time. Right, so if you look at any of the more advanced prayer apps, they'll have the Fajr time, but under that they'll have a range. Right? And they'll give you like the mean of that range, or like the average of that range, the middle point. And they'll say that this is Fajr time. But technically, if you think about it, they're saying that it's any time within this 10-minute period. And they'll say that it's, so instead of saying, they'll say it's 7:35, but under that it'll say between 7:30 and 7:40. Right, so because of that, the 15 minutes is cautious. Right, so even their ranges won't go that much. Right, so 15 minutes is cautious. But technically, in the Hanafi school, the ruling is you have to stop before Fajr. That's the ruling, right? And it's not, there's no obligation in stopping before the Fajr. But again, if there is any possibility that you may be continuing eating after the sun has already risen, then you have to stop ahead of time to be cautious as a prerequisite to starting the fast properly. And then the scholars, just to make it easy for us, they determine 50 minutes is enough. But even the Hanafi should follow that. Right? Unless there's like a big mistake. Someone woke up late and they have health problems that if they don't drink or eat something at all, then they're going to not be able to fast. Right? And it's only a minute or two after the imsak time. Then in the Hanafi school, that it's not that. Then there's a bit more wiggle room for that. But to unnecessarily, without the need to do that, we should stop before. We should be stopping at that time. That was the second one, right? Is there any questions? I have to kind of look around the camera. So next he talks about what is makruh for the fasting person. What is disliked? Right? And disliked is a lower level than haram. Right? So the disliked, right, it can either be blameworthy or could be somewhat sinful. It can be sinful. Right? In the Hanafi school, we have a difference between the two types of makruh. There's a somewhat disliked, and then there's the prohibitively disliked. Whereas in the Shafi'i school, the makruh is just makruh. Right? I don't believe they have the full breakdown that we have. Right? So some of these are makruh because they could lead to breaking the fast. So the first one is hijama, cupping. In the Hanafi school, cupping is not makruh, right, in and of itself. Right? And even here he mentions in the footnotes that according to Imam Ahmed, doing the hijama on someone or getting the hijama done breaks your fast. Right? And that's because of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. However, the other scholars, they understood that hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to mean that the person who does the hijama for someone else, if we understood how hijama was done back then, right, that they used to have like a type of horn, and they didn't have suction guns like we have, right? They had to actually use their mouths and pull out and use the mouth to make the suction pressure. So in that case, something could easily go into the throat. So it's very likely that the one who does the hijama on someone else can break their fast. Then as for the one who's getting the hijama done, that if they become so weak that they can't fast, that they have to break the fast, then essentially, by doing the hijama, they're putting themselves in jeopardy of breaking the fast. So in the Hanafi school, as well as the Maliki school, that if doing the hijama or getting the hijama done will make you weak to the point that you may have to break your fast, then it's makruh for you to do that. And that applies to anything that would cause you to become weak, that you are not in need of doing. Right? So like going to the gym in Ramadan. Right? If someone can go to the gym and be fine and not be in jeopardy of having to break their fast, then it's not makruh for them. Right? But if going to the gym will make them so weak that it's possible that they may have to give in for health reasons or because of severe hunger or severe thirst or severe fatigue, and they're going to break their fast, then it would be makruh for them to even go in the first place. In the Shafi'i school, if there is a need to do the hijama, like there's a medical need to do the hijama, then it's not makruh. Right? But without need, doing the hijama is makruh in and of itself. The second thing is al-mubalagha fil madmada wal istinshaq. Right? What's a good translation for this? To exaggerate the washing of the mouth and the washing of the nose in the wudu or the ghusl. Right? So when you take water into your mouth in the wudu and you swish it around, right? It is sunnah, it is a recommended act in the Hanafi school to make mubalagha, as well in the Shafi school. It's a sunnah to make mubalagha, to make sure the water gets everywhere, all over the mouth. Right, by moving it around, but during Ramadan, that mubalagha falls off. It's no longer a sunnah. Why? Because if you make sure the water gets all the way back to the throat, it's very likely that you may swallow something. But the rinsing of the mouth in general is still a sunnah, but you would do it lightly. it's still sunnah. You would do it lightly. And then in the Hanafi school, if you spit once, any residual wetness in your mouth doesn't break the fast. And I believe the Shafis are similar. The same thing with the nose. If one puts water in their nose lightly, right, it doesn't break the fast. But if someone really gives it a go and it goes all the way up to the brain, just as a point, if it hurts, you're doing something wrong. Right? If Deen hurts, you're doing something wrong, or you need to stretch. Right? One of the two things. Because I know some people, they think, okay, mubalagha in washing the nose. You have to make exaggerated effort to wash the nose, and they breathe in so much water and it burns their brain, and right, that's not part of the Deen. Right, so he says going to excess in washing the mouth and the nose. Then he says chewing on something like luban. Now luban is frankincense, but it's also known as Arabic gum. So anyone likes chewing gum, if you look in the ingredients, it has something called Arabic gum. Arabic gum is frankincense. There's a type that's really good for your digestion, right? But it's a gum in so far as its texture is gummy, but it has zero taste, zero flavor, zero ingredients. It's natural, so you're not actually swallowing it. Right? It stays intact, right? And the saliva is just your saliva, as opposed to regular gum. You're chewing it, but your saliva is not being mixed with the sweetness of that, and you're swallowing the sweetness. Right? So that would break the fast if it was regular gum, right? But chewing this type of luban, right? Chewing luban or frankincense, or even chewing on anything that doesn't have like a sweetness or anything that would go with your saliva and swallow, right, would be makruh, because of the obvious thing, you're supposed to not eat, but you're putting things in your mouth. It's like trying not to get burned while standing next to the fire. And so it's putting oneself in jeopardy unnecessarily for no apparent reason. Right? But he mentions that if there is any flavor or anything and it mixes with the saliva and that is swallowed, then it will break the fast. And the same thing would be correct in the Hanafi school. Unless the person, after doing it, spat out and then there was residual flavor, then that wouldn't break the fast. Right, so this would apply to chewing things, right? And we mentioned yesterday the exception of tasting food for if someone, for instance, had guests coming over, or someone who had a hot temper that they're cooking for. You could say if someone worked as a chef, and they have to serve. If a mother has to soften the food for their children to be able to eat it, right, that would also be permissible for them, but they have to be very careful not to swallow it. And then after they take out the food, then they would rinse their mouth and spit once. And then after that, anything that they swallow was just residual, and it wouldn't break the fast. The next thing he mentions is kissing. Right? But kissing, for the one who fears that it may lead to ejaculation in some way. Right? Either it may lead to intercourse, or it may lead to direct ejaculation just from the kissing itself. Right? And he says that if the person does fear that could happen, it's haram. It's haram to kiss. Right? And he mentions the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where one man came to him and said, is it okay for me to kiss my wife in Ramadan? And he said, yes. Another person came and said, is it okay for me to kiss my wife in Ramadan? He said, no. And one of the Sahabi watching from the side, he's like, you told the one guy yes, and you told this guy no. He said, but that guy was an older man. He can control himself, but this guy just got married. Right? And that's why some people don't like to get married in Ramadan, right? Because around the time of Ramadan. And he says tasting things, and we already talked about that. Tasting things, we mentioned the rulings about that, right? But as long as it doesn't reach the throat, right, then it doesn't break. But it would be disliked in both the Hanafi and the Shafi'i school. But the Hanafi school, if there is a need to do it, then it would be allowed. Especially like some children, like they can't eat hard food. Right? And in previous times, they didn't have Gerber and all these little cans of mush. Right? So you had to actually chew the food down and give it to them, similar to what the birds do. So for them, you really have no other choice but to do that. Right? So it was permissible for them. Tamam. So then, like we said, we're going to skip the section on the Badr, the people of Badr, and just complete these last fiqh issues. And then tomorrow, inshallah, we can enjoy the story of Badr and the story of the conquest of Mecca. He mentions a few kind of miscellaneous issues, and we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to kind of pick the ones that are most common. He says that the ruling of the one who consumes or who takes any of these things that break your fast out of ignorance. So in general, ignorance is not an excuse. Right? To say, oh, I didn't know I couldn't drink either. Right? That's not an excuse unless someone just became Muslim. If someone just became Muslim, he mentions a list here. He says, the first he says, Hadith Ahd bil Islam, someone who's a new Muslim. Right? And they knew they had to fast. And someone said, oh, you have to fast. But they didn't know what that required. They just thought, okay, I don't have to eat. I can't eat. Right? But they drank some water. Right? So for them, they will be excused. Right? The second would be a person who does not have the ability to learn the rulings of Islam, or of fasting and specifically, either because they grew up and they live in a place that is far from people of knowledge, or from the scholars, or they live far away from the scholars, such that they don't have the means to get to them. And today with internet, for many of the places in the world, that is no longer an excuse. But there are still many places that are cut off from internet, and we don't realize it. But there are still a very, very large percentage of the world that doesn't even have a phone, like very high percentages, right? Let alone a smartphone, right? So there are people in this world that are far away from the ability to reach a scholar, and we were able to see, kind of witness a little bit of this in some of the very outskirts villages of Yemen. Like these are places there's no electricity, let alone Wi-Fi, let alone to have like a Nokia symbol or a signal, right? Right. And if you go to these places, you'll see that they don't really know how to make wudu. They don't. Right? They'll like make masah on their face. They'll just wipe their face, and to some extent they're excused, but to some extent. There is an obligation. فَإِنْ لَمْ تَجِدْ مُعَلِّمًا فَلْيَسْأَلِ مَنْ لَمْ يكن يعلم ذا فَلْيَسْأَلِ وَمَنْ لَمْ يجد مُعَلِّمًا فَلْيَرْحَلِ. Whoever doesn't know that, let them ask, and whoever can't find a teacher, let them travel. Right? But these are very poor people. They can't really just get up and leave and go. Right? So then it would be an obligation on the ulama nearby, and they are doing it slowly but surely. But it's difficult. You can't just come in and say, "Sit down, I'm going to teach you." You have to build relationships and stuff. So they're trying to do it. So that is an excuse, right? But if it's someone who is just, who has the opportunity to study, they have the means there for them, and they just didn't out of remissness, then they're not excused. And then the rulings of that remissness would have to be learned. They'd have to make up those prayers, those fasts, and make tawbah. Then he talks about, so that's the ruling of breaking the fast, jahlan, right? Ignorant, or out of ignorance. The second is, what about nisyanan, forgetfully? You forgot you were fasting. We alluded to a little bit of this earlier. So he mentions the hadith of Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet said, whoever eats or drinks forgetfully, then let them complete their fast. For indeed, Allah has fed them and gave them drink. Right, so, and even though the hadith speaks about food and drink, it applies to everything that would break the fast. If a person did it in forgetting that they were fasting, the fast is valid. So this even applies to intercourse, right? But if a person, for instance, was eating and they forgot that they were fasting and they started eating, but middle of all their eating, they remembered, immediately they have to remove the food that's in their mouth. Or immediately, if they're engaged in something that would break the fast, they have to immediately stop. And if they continue even a little bit, it breaks the fast. Because the condition of nisyan is no longer there. And this is part of a larger principle that from a hadith, indeed Allah has forgiven for my ummah for mistakes, forgetfulness, and things that they were forced to do. Which brings us to the next, right? If someone is forced to break their fast, or if your brother wants to play a prank on you and he squirts some water on your face while you were sleeping, right? But you sleep with your mouth open and water went in, you swallowed it, right? In the Shafi'i school, I don't know if that would be considered a Makruh. Is that considered someone who's forced? If someone said to you, either you eat this right now, or I'm going to hit you. And there's a lot of some countries that are very anti-Islamic, right? Especially not so much as the past. There was a lot more in the past, right? You have Bosnia, Albania, right? I always pronounce this wrong. Srebrenica, right? Places where the Muslims were persecuted, and any symbol that you were practicing Islam would get you thrown in jail or killed. They found the Quran, you're done, right? And they found out that you were fasting, and in a lot of those places, in order to make sure that you weren't fasting, they would force you to eat something. So in the Shafi'i school, that would not break your fast. Allahu Akbar. Right? And that's a beautiful thing, both going back from that hadith just now, that what people were forced to do. In the Hanafi school, it would break the fast, but they're not as sinful at all for it, but they would make it up another day. And then lastly, there is a few issues, but for the sake of time, he says that anyone who wakes up in a state of major ritual impurity, or is in a major ritual impurity before Fajr came in, then the fast is valid. Or after Fajr came in, but it wasn't due to any action of their own. So it was, for instance, a nocturnal emission, a wet dream. Then the fast would be valid because that's not considered breaking your fast, even though there may have been an ejaculation. It wasn't from your own doing. So he mentions the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha, that the Prophet ﷺ would reach the Fajr in Ramadan in a state of ritual impurity, meaning the ritual impurity that happened before Fajr came in, and then Fajr came in. So the ritual impurity happened before Fajr, and then Fajr came in, and then he would take a ghusl and continue to fast. And Imam Muslim adds to this, وَلَا يَقْضِي, and he wouldn't make up that day. So the fast counts. Because Allah says that فَالْآنَ بَاشِرُوهُنَّ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ. That Allah says, then now have relations with them, meaning your spouses, until the break of dawn in the Quran. So that means that all the way up until the break of dawn is permissible. Right? It's only when the break of dawn starts that these things are not permissible. We already talked about these next two rulings about kissing, and we talked about the washing of the mouth and the nose. Tamam. And then just for, I don't know how many, we should take a poll how many Shafi'is are here. He mentions lastly that whoever has days of the previous Ramadan to make up, that in the Shafi'i school you have to make them up before the next Ramadan, if possible. Right? If they haven't made it up and then the next Ramadan came in, then they still have to make it up, but they also have to pay an expiatory charity for each day, which is a mud, which he mentions here. In a modern, I have to find out what the modern weight of that would be. Right, in the Hanafi school, that if you didn't make up the previous Ramadan's fasts, right, even if this Ramadan comes in, you don't have to do anything more than make that up. You still have to make those days up. So we'll stop there. If there's any questions, we can take them. Any questions? Stay away from the auctions. Sure. Yes, great question. So if a person is elderly, such that they can't fast, or they're sick, such that they can't fast, and there's no likelihood that they would ever come out of that state where they could fast in the future, then instead of fasting, they would pay an expiatory charity for each individual day of Ramadan. And the amount is the 2.2 kilograms of wheat. Right? For each day given to a poor person. Now in the Hanafi school, you don't have to actually give the wheat itself, you can give the monetary value. So what you would have to do is you can just go to the local supermarket, go to the wheat where they have the bags of wheat, and just say, okay, this is the most expensive brand, this is the most cheapest brand, the one in the middle, how much does that cost? Right? How much is the unit price of 2.2 kg? Right? Times that by 30 and give that charity. Right? But if it's a sickness that a person may in the future become freed of, then when they do become freed of it, then they'd have to make qada of those days. They wouldn't give, if they knew that there's a day that maybe years from now that they would get better, that they don't make the expiation, they would just make the qada at that time. But if there's no likelihood that they would get better, then they would make the expiation. And then if suddenly they did get better, then they would make the qada, and there's no sin on them for doing that. As for the Shafi'i school, I don't know exactly the specific requirements. Actually, he does mention it right here. It's like literally right on the page. So he says that sickness is of two types. The first is the one that is that there is a likelihood that one may get better, right? But at the moment they're sick and it's difficult for them to fast. Then for them they have the option to not fast, and they have to make up the fast at a later date. But there's no expiation for them. The second is a type of sickness that there is no likelihood that they're going to get better from, and it's difficult to do the fasting with that sickness. Then for them, they don't fast. And for each day that they don't fast, they pay the fidyah, which is, he mentions, it's a mud of the staple food of the area. And they'll give it to the poor person or the mud, he mentions here, I have to check how much the mud is. I'm not exactly sure how much. A mud is a measurement that they used to use in the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Any other questions? In the Shafi'i school, it's one mud for each day. In the Hanafi school, it's 2.2 kg, right, for each day to one person, right, or the monetary value. So if you find out that at Weiss it costs $5 for 2.2 kg, then you give $5 per day to the poor person, and that's sufficient. So there's a little bit of fiqh issues that remain, and we'll keep them for another day after we do the Badr stories and everything, about the pregnant woman, the one who's nursing, the traveler, fasting on behalf of someone who passed away, and similar rulings. So we'll take those then. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير. If there's any questions, please just write them. You can write them down, or you can email them in, especially if there's nuanced questions of specific circumstances.